What if I told you that before the God you know, even before Yahweh was worshipped on the pages of the Bible, there was a black deity that reigned absolutely over heaven and earth? Such a powerful, so influential presence that it shaped integer cultures, religions, and empires. But it was erased from official history by human hands, hidden interests, and for a fear that crossed generations. This is not any theory. This is a revelation that, if you have the courage to listen to the end, can forever change the way you see the spirit world and even your faith. The truth is that there are millennia, peoples of African regions and the Middle East worshipped a divine figure of black skin associated with creation, justice, and absolute power. But over time, this deity was silently replaced, forgotten, and even demonized. Why? What was there in this story that it was so dangerous that it had to be hidden? Who has decided that this part of the narrative should never come to you? Get ready, because in the next revelations, we will open doors that many people would rather keep closed. Let's talk about archaeological records that show images of this black deity sculpted in stone thousands of years before the first biblical scriptures. We will examine apocryphal texts and old manuscripts that, for some reason, were left out of the official canon of the Bible. And that's not all. You will see how prophets and spiritual leaders of antiquity carried clear signs they knew, and perhaps revered, this divine figure before the rise of the biblical God. But don't expect to hear this story in churches or textbooks. Throughout history, there has been a deliberate effort to erase any mention of this deity from dominant religious traditions. Her image was distorted, her forgotten name, and her influence buried in centuries of silence. However, traces continue to appear in archaeological discoveries, in myths preserved by African peoples, in symbols that still survive disguised within the Judeo-Christian tradition itself. Imagine that behind all the narrative we know, there is a hidden prologue, a previous era, a lost chapter in which this black deity was the center of worship and the maximum symbol of power. Imagine that suddenly someone decided to rewrite this story by erasing his protagonist and replacing it with another divine figure, more aligned with new political, theological, and cultural interests. This is exactly what evidence suggests. And don't think we're just talking about historical curiosities. The impact of this concealment echoes to this day. Understanding who this black deity was, why it was banned, and how its worship has been replaced can radically change the way we interpret not only the Bible, but the whole history of human spirituality. It can reveal as concepts of faith, morals, and power have been shaped and manipulated over the centuries. Throughout this video, we will follow the tracks of this forgotten figure, analyzing African mythologies, Semitic traditions, old inscriptions, and controversial theories that few dare to investigate. Let's connect the parts that form a surprising picture, where the past and the present are in a way that challenges what you have learned so far. So if you think you already know the whole story about God and creation, get ready to be surprised. Because what is to come is not just information. It is a revelation capable of shaking the foundations of your spiritual vision. And remember, all this is just the beginning. The next step is to understand how this black deity came about, where your power came from, and what fate has relegated you to oblivion. A journey that begins now and will lead you far beyond the pages you know. And before we dive even deeper into this investigation, I want to hear from you. What do you think of this possibility? Have you ever heard of a black deity that ruled before the God of the Bible? Your opinion is fundamental, because this is not just a theme to passively watch. It is a subject that needs to be discussed, questioned, and shared. When you leave a comment below, you help create a space where the truth is not suffocated by silence. This is how we can bring out issues that many prefer to leave hidden. So write what you think. Bring your doubts, your theories. Your voice is part of this search. And if this content is already opening your eyes for new perspectives, be sure to leave your like. This shows YouTube that this video is important and makes it come to more people who, like you, want to find out what has been erased from the story. Enjoy and subscribe to the channel right now because this journey is just starting. Each video here is a piece of this puzzle. And if you do not follow, you will lose important connections that they will change the way you understand spirituality and the very history of humanity. So, he comments, leaves the like, and signs up to walk with me in this investigation. The next chapter can be the most revealing of all, and you won't want to be left out. When we talk about the origins of faith, Most people begin their timeline directly in the traditional biblical narrative, as if the history of spirituality had begun there in the pages of Genesis. But the truth, and this is something many do not want to admit, is that long before the Bible was written, there were already extremely advanced civilizations in Africa and the Middle East that had complex religious systems, full of symbols, rituals, and deities that shaped the collective imaginary for millennia. These cultures not only created monumental cities, but also developed deep cosmovisions about what was above and below visible sky, divine power, and the connection between the human and the spiritual. Think, for example, in the great African civilizations, such as the ancient kingdom of Kush, the Nubia, or the rich traditions of the Nile Valley. These peoples venerated divine figures that not only ruled on the elements of nature, but were also seen as the creators of the cosmic order. Many of these deities were represented with black features and skin, associated with fertility, life, justice, and supreme authority. This is where the first shock begins to appear. We find intriguing parallels between these figures and spiritual concepts that would later be incorporated, and in some cases adapted, in Hebrew and Christian traditions. In the Middle East, even before the rise of Israel as a nation, peoples such as the Sumerians, Akkadios, Babylonians, and Canaanites also worshipped gods who had attributes and narratives very similar to those we see centuries later attributed to the biblical God. But there is a detail that is rarely spoken. Commercial routes and human migrations made ideas and beliefs mingle. This means that we did not live in isolated spiritual worlds. There was a constant exchange of symbols, myths, and even sacred names. And when we cross this historical data with archaeological records, the picture begins to gain even more intriguing contours. Stone sculptures with thousands of years, found in regions of Sudan and Egypt, show representations of black divine figures sitting on thrones, with royal symbols that would later be seen in Yahweh descriptions in the Old Testament. Mural paintings, ceramic fragments, and inscriptions on ancient temples describe beings that reigned over heavens and lands long before the official biblical narrative took shape. These are not modern inventions or theories without the basis. They are physical evidence preserved by millennia that bolder scholars have been trying to decipher, despite the resistance of more conservative religious and academic institutions. The apocryphal texts, those that were excluded from the official canon, further reinforce this line of investigation. Books such as Enoch, Jubilees, and other manuscripts found in the Qumran Desert mention beings and events that seem not to fit perfectly into the picture we know. In some of these texts, there is a suggestion of pre-existing deities, powerful beings who acted before creation as described in Genesis. And here, again, descriptions that refer to characteristics associated with African deities: dark skin, power over life and death, authority over the elements, and especially a direct and personal relationship with humanity. We must not forget that the story is written by winners, and that includes spiritual history. When a new religious system establishes itself, it not only proposes new beliefs, but often erases, distorts, or absorbs elements of previous cults to legitimize its own narrative. This is exactly what seems to have happened to this black deity. Its story has been diluted, reinterpreted, or simply scratched from official records until it becomes invisible to most people. The most fascinating thing is to realize how, despite this erasing effort, traces of this worship remain alive in oral traditions, symbols hidden in ancient churches, and even popular spiritual practices that survived over the centuries. Some African communities preserved legends that speak of a king of heavens of black skin, protective of humanity, who was removed from the throne by other gods. In regions of the Middle East, solar and lunar symbols associated with this deity can still be seen in ruins and ritual objects. Now stop and think. If this information was widely known, wouldn't our understanding of the origins of faith completely change? They would not put the linear narrative we learn, where a single God has always been in the center since I am Ichidi. This raises profound questions about identity, cultural heritage, and even who has the right to define what is spiritual truth. And this is where I want you to start reflecting while we go to the next revelations. I want you to tell me in the comments if this historical panorama makes sense to you, or if you think it was all cultural coincidence. Write down there the phrase, "The story always leaves tracks," to show that you are following this journey to the end. Its participation is essential. because each comment strengthens this investigation and helps keep this conversation alive. If you think you've seen something similar in another culture, or if you heard stories that connect black deities to myths of creation, I want to know. Remember, we are just starting to add the pieces, and the frame that will form can be much larger than you think. And in the next step, let's dive even deeper into the reports they describe in detail. Who was this mysterious figure and how she exerted her absolute power over heaven and earth before she disappeared from the pages we know today? When we dive into the deepest roots of human spiritual history, we find fragments, scattered pieces of narratives that, when gathered, reveal something surprising. Long before any mention of Yahweh or the monotheistic structure we know today, there were records of a figure of absolute power, revered with fear and devotion, known in certain traditions such as the Lady of Heaven or the Skin of Ebony skin. These references are not in ordinary books. They appear on clay tablets, in hieroglyphics recorded on the temple walls, in fragments of scrolls that escaped to time and religious censorship. In Sumerian myths, for example, there are reports of deities that not only created the order of the world, but also established laws, taught agriculture, astronomy, and war arts to men. Among these beings, there is an enigmatic description, a majestic figure, dark, skinned like polished basalt, dressed in golden ornaments that reflected sunlight. This deity, according to some texts, reigned not only on the earth, but also over the heavens and the deep waters, having an absolute rule over the forces of nature. Already in ancient Egypt, we found something even more intriguing. Some representations show a god or goddess with clearly African features, sitting on a throne flanked by eternal life symbols, with the skin represented in shades ranging from deep to intense black, something that for Egyptian iconography had a sacred meaning linked to fertility, rebirth, and life force. Interestingly, certain papyrus mention a period prior to the exclusive worship of Ra or Osiris, when this black-skinned figure was the center of the spiritual and political life of the people. Among the Canaanites, who lived in regions near the biblical lands, there are also traces of a powerful deity, called by names that varied according to the region, but carried similar attributes: creator of laws, guardian of order, and able to bless or destroy entire civilizations. Some archaeologists argue that inscriptions found in steles and worship artifacts show indirect references to this figure, always associated with celestial power and an authority preceding the Hebrew pantheon itself. The characteristics attributed to this black deity were so striking that they crossed centuries in the memory of the peoples. She was described as an imposing presence entity, able to inspire respect and fear at the same time. His dark skin was not seen as merely physical, but as a symbol of power, connection with fertile earth, and the hidden mysteries of the cosmos. The reports speak of eyes that shone like precious stones, a voice that resonated as thunder, and an aura that radiated heat, as if it were the incarnate sun itself in human form. In some narratives, this deity not only ruled, but walked among men, participating in important decisions, guiding kings and warriors, teaching priests and prophets. It was a being that was not isolated in an unreachable plan, but interacting, which was to see and hear, leaving deep marks on the cultures that worshipped it. It is impossible not to note that many of these descriptions are subtly echoed in later biblical passages, which raises an inevitable question. Is the God we know inherited symbols, attributes, and even stories of this older figure? The most uncomfortable for some scholars is that by comparing these reports with certain apocryphal passages and hidden texts, we realized a continuity that should not exist if they were totally different deities. Why are some symbols used to represent the God of Israel identical to the used millennia before for this black deity? Why so separate traditions would you in time and space share such similar images and metaphors? The priests of antiquity knew that images and stories have almost indestructible power. Therefore, when a new service was imposed, it did not completely destroy the old, absorbed what was useful to him, and erased what could threaten his supremacy. And perhaps that's exactly what happened to this black-skinned figure. Instead of being destroyed, it was transformed, its attributes incorporated into a new god, and its true identity carefully hidden. This is a part of the story that rarely appears in sermons or old history classes. It is not comfortable because it forces to question who was really at the center of worship in the early days of humanity and what was lost, or purposely hidden, over the centuries. But that's precisely why we are here, to look beyond what we were told, to examine the tracks that survived and try to rebuild the original truth. If you have gotten here, I want you to actively participate in this investigation. Leave it in the comments if you believe this figure described in the Sumerian, Egyptian, and Canaanite myths could be the same, just called by different names throughout history. Write the phrase, "The names change, but the truth remains," to show that you are following and understanding what we are building together. Its interaction is what keeps this conversation alive and ensures that more people have access to these revelations. And if you think this is already intriguing, wait until we dive into the next accounts, where even more direct evidence begin to reveal the reach of the power of this black deity and the role it may have played in the formation of the beliefs that shaped our whole civilization. When we leave the territory of official history and advance through the less exploited paths of religious tradition, we enter a world of forgotten, hidden, or simply rejected texts by the authorities who decided what could or could not be called the Word of God. These are the so-called apocryphal texts and lost books, works that, for theological, political, or cultural reasons, have never been part of the biblical canon. But it is exactly in them that we find the most unsettling clues about the existence of divine beings before Yahweh, powerful figures that not only coexisted with other gods, but in some cases seemed to dominate the spiritual scenario before its ascension. A remarkable example is the Book of Enoch, a work that survived in fragments and Ethiopian versions, kept alive by communities that refused to let it disappear. In it, we found reports of heavenly beings who descended to the earth, interacted with men, and exercised authority long before the alliances described in the Old Testament. Some of these beings are described with a grandeur that resembles the ancient representations of the black divinity, high thrones, mastery over elements of nature, a direct connection with humanity, and a wisdom that was not derived from Yahweh, but of an earlier order. Another text, Abraham's Apocalypse, brings a little discussed excerpt, where a power figure prior to the divine revelation we know in the Bible is mentioned. This figure is presented as guardian of justice and creation, someone who had authority over the fate of nations before the enthronement of the God of Israel. It is curious to note that, between the lines, this description does not exclude the existence of Yahweh, but presents it as part of a historical process of transition of power on the spiritual plane, something extremely uncomfortable for traditions that preach a single and eternal God without predecessors. The manuscripts of the Dead Sea, discovered in the caves of Qumran, also offer flashes of this forgotten narrative. Among them are hymns, psalms, and treatises that speak of beings who ruled heaven and earth before what we call biblical creation. The descriptions of these ancient rulers vary, but it is not uncommon to find references to dark-skinned figures associated with creative power and universal fertility. These passages were largely kept away from the general public, either due to difficulty in translation or by conscious decisions of not promoting ideas that can shake traditional doctrine. And here comes the question that does not want to silence. Why are these passages not in the official Bible? The answer is not simple, but it involves decisions made by councils and religious leaders over the centuries. In establishing the canon, it was not only sought to gather inspired texts, but also to create a coherent and theologically safe narrative. Any material that suggested the existence of previous or parallel deities to Yahweh was a direct threat to the monotheistic doctrine. Thus, many of these writings were labeled as heretic, pagan, or simply not inspired, being slowly forgotten or destroyed. The most ironic is that even outside the canon, these texts continued to circulate in isolated communities, preserving pieces of this story that mainstream tried to erase. In North Africa, the Middle East, and some non-Orthodox Jewish traditions, stories are still told and recite verses that refer to these ancient beings. Some monks and scholars even claim that certain details of these apocryphal texts can be found in a coded manner in the official deed themselves, as if part of the truth had been hidden in the sight of all. When we join the descriptions of these lost books with what we have seen in archaeological records and myths of ancient civilizations, the pattern begins to become difficult to ignore. The figure of the black deity, so present in African cultures and the Middle East before the consolidation of monotheism, appears as a persistent echo, a historical ghost that resists being erased. This connection is not just a literary coincidence. She suggests that, at the core of spiritual traditions, there is a shared memory of an earlier power, a deity that has been replaced, but never fully forgotten. And here, once again, the question is to you who are following this investigation. Why do you think these texts were really excluded? Was it a mere coincidence or a deliberate maneuver to ensure that only one version of the story was told? I want you to write in the comments the phrase, "Truth always finds a way," if believed that, as much as they try, the story cannot be buried forever. This will show me that you are connected with the essence of this research and understand the importance of recovering these forgotten narratives. Keep this reflection well, because as we move forward, let's see how these loose pieces of apocryphal texts fit into concrete evidence left by our ancestors, evidence that can radically change the way we interpret the very origin of faith and divine authority in the history of humanity. When we enter the field of archaeological and anthropological evidence, research is no longer just a matter of interpreting old texts to become a palpable, concrete, which you can see, play, and in some cases, until feeling the energy that seems to emanate from objects preserved by millennia. Throughout excavations at different parts of Africa and the Middle East, researchers have found an impressive variety of artifacts that represent divine black figures, with physical and symbolic characteristics that directly refer to pre-biblical spiritual narratives. In regions of the ancient Kush kingdom, for example, statues of basalt and granite were discovered that portray entities with striking African features: wide nose, thick lips, almond eyes, and an undisputed posture of authority. These often enthroned figures adorned with crowns and scepters have symbolic elements that we also find later in representations of biblical kings and priests. It is impossible to ignore the detail of the skin painted in dark tones, not only as a reflection of the ethnic reality of the region, but as a spiritual symbol linked to fertility, regeneration power, and direct connection with the earth. In Egypt, murals of temples and tombs still retain images of gods and goddesses represented with black skin, surrounded by hieroglyphics that describe them as creators, legislators, and protectors of the people. In many of these records, there is a direct association between skin color and the concept of Kemet, black earth, not only in reference to the Nile fertile soil, but also to the divine essence that fertilizes life and sustains the cosmic order. For many independent scholars, this association is no coincidence. It coded the memory of a supreme deity of black skin that was worshipped before other figures become central in the pantheon. In Semitic regions, especially in areas that today correspond to the uprising, stones and ritual objects were found with recordings of dark-skinned figures in a position of blessing or judgment. Some inscriptions written in Proto-Hebraic or seamed languages bring honorary titles that can be translated as Lord of Heaven and Earth or Judge of Nations. It is remarkable that such titles are very similar to those attributed later to Yahweh, raising the question if it has been inherited, adapted, or reinterpreted from previous cults. Anthropology also contributes to this narrative by revealing that in various sub-Saharan African cultures, there are oral traditions that speak of a dark-skinned god that ruled before the arrival of new religions. These stories, transmitted from generation to generation, describe a being that walked among men, established laws, judged disputes, and protected the people against hostile forces. In some versions, he mysteriously disappears, being replaced by a new god brought by foreigners, a detail that echoes what we see in written and archaeological records. Some archaeologists reported that during excavations in the Sahel and Africa Horn, found the sun's sunrise altars, decorated with sunscreens and lunar symbols, and with sculptures of black figures sitting on thrones, surrounded by animals that, in other cultures, are also symbols of divinity. This suggests an organized, structured cult, which had not only rituals, but also a well-defined theology. When we gather all these elements, sculptures, murals, inscriptions, and oral traditions, the picture that forms is impressive. The figure of the black deity is not an isolated myth of a lost culture in time. It repeatedly appears in different geographies, with names and symbolic variations, but always keeping the same nucleus: supreme power, direct connection with the fertility of the earth, dominion over human destiny, and authority over heaven and earth. The detail that intrigues the most, in some cases, these artifacts and records were literally buried under later buildings, as if the intention were to hide, bury, and make forget. There are temples erected over older sites, where the original walls with black figures were covered by plaster or new notches. This practice of erasing the religious past to impose a new spiritual order is well documented in history, and here it seems to have been used to replace the worship of this ancestral deity with a new narrative. And there are still the symbols that persist, even after all this substitution. Certain geometric patterns, color combinations, and ornaments that were used to represent the black deity appear centuries later, such as decoration of sacred objects in already monotheistic traditions. This is more than an aesthetic coincidence. It is proof that visual memories have resisted censorship, surviving disguised under new interpretations. These findings force us to question how many layers of history were overlapping to reach the narrative we know today, and how many of these artifacts are still hiding in museum deposits beyond the public's reach because they show something that challenges what they taught us. I want you who are following this video, tell me in the comments, seeing this evidence, do you believe that the image of the God we know today may have inherited elements of this older black deity? Write the phrase, "Earth keeps the memory," so that I know that you are absorbing every piece of this puzzle. Keep this reflection, because at the next point we will explore something even more provocative, not just material evidence, but the reports that speak of a heavenly conflict, a power dispute in the divine plan itself, which may have been the decisive milestone for the disappearance of this spiritual throne of humanity. When we look at the older stories preserved by humanity, we realize that there is a conductive thread that crosses cultures, tongues, and centuries. The idea that the spirit world is not a place of absolute peace, but a kingdom where powerful forces come into shock, supremacy, and the right to rule over heaven and land. Even before the consolidated biblical narrative, there are theories and accounts that speak of a colossal dispute, a heavenly conflict that has forever changed the fate of humanity. And at the center of this dispute, there is evidence that the black deity, which once reigned absolute, was challenged, overthrown, or replaced by another divine figure that would occupy the throne of worship. Imagine a time when heavens were not governed by a single god, but by a complex hierarchy of powerful beings, each with its dominion and legions. This is the structure we find in many ancient mythologies. Gods of war, fertility, death, waters, all coexisting, not always in harmony. In Sumerian records, there are stories of titanic battles between deities, wars that were not only symbolic but described as real clashes, with heavenly weapons capable of shaking mountains and sharing the oceans. In some versions of these reports, the black deity was seen as the original conductor, holding an absolute power over the forces of life and order. But as in every history of power, there were those who wanted to take their place. In myths preserved in Egypt and reinterpreted in the Middle East, one speaks of a lift within the divine council itself. One or more gods, moved by ambition or disagreements of vision, begin a rebellion against the reigning sovereign. This echo of war in the heavens later reappears, renovated, in biblical passages that speak of angelic battles, but not to mention the previous ruler who was deposed. Compares them mythologies from different cultures make this narrative even more intriguing. In Greek reports, we have the Titan War against the gods of Olympus, a confrontation between an old and a new generation, which ends with the victory of the younger ones and the imprisonment of the ancient sovereigns. In Hindu traditions, the struggle between Devas and Asuras presents a similar dynamic, cosmic battles in the order of the universe, where the winner is not always the fairer, but the most strategic. Even in the Nordic stories, there are echoes of this idea, with Odin and the Aesir facing other divine races to consolidate their domain. What is impressive is how these narratives, scattered around the world, keep parallels with the theory that the black deity was the victim of a cosmic blow. What's more, in some African oral traditions, the story is even clearer. There are legends that speak of a heavenly king of dark-skinned who was betrayed by his own allies, expelled from his position, and forced to withdraw to a distant or invisible kingdom, promising one day to return. These stories are passed from generation to generation, preserving the memory of a deposed sovereign and war that changed the balance of the spirit world. Some independent scholars suggest that the biblical account of Lucifer's fall, for example, may be a rewritten version of this previous conflict, where the papers were reorganized to adapt to the new religious order. It is as if the story has been edited for the winner to be portrayed as the legitimate ruler from the beginning, while the loser, possibly the black deity or someone loyal to her, was erased or demonized. This strategy of rewriting history from the winner's point of view is not new. It is something we have ever seen in politics, military history, and of course, in spiritual history. In some apocryphal texts, there are fragmented stretches that speak of wars in the firmament and thrones that have fallen before the creation of man as we know. In them, a latent tension between different spiritual factions is perceived, each trying to impose their view of order on earth and humans. It is possible that the transition between the age of black deity and the rise of the biblical god was precisely the result of one of these clashes, where victory was not only a matter of strength, but who could rewrite the past to shape the future. Archaeology, in turn, also offers clues to this conflict. In some ruins, inscriptions were found that seemed to narrate heavenly battles, with symbols of destruction and fire falling from heaven. Interestingly, certain representations show dark-skinned figures in a position of combat against distinct-looking enemies, suggesting a rivalry that can have deep spiritual roots. All of this leads us to think that the transition of power in heaven was not a simple divine act, but a complex process, full of betrayals, strategies, and confrontations, whose consequences are still echoing in our religious traditions. And that is why understanding this forgotten heavenly conflict is fundamental. It not only explains the disappearance of the black deity, but it also reveals how current narratives can be the result of a long spiritual control campaign. Now, I want you, who is here with me in this investigation, tell me in the comments, do you believe that this war in the spirit world really happened and that the story was rewritten to hide the losing side? Write the phrase, "The sky also has battles," so that I know that you are closely following and absorbing every detail of this historical reconstruction. Keep this reflection, because in the next step we will explore something equally impactful: the reasons for which this story was erased, who was interested in doing this, and how this erasure shaped everything you think knowing about the origin of the divine. When we analyze not only the stories, but also the historical and political context that shaped the beliefs that came to us, we began to realize that the erasure of the black deity was neither an accident nor a simple collective forgetfulness. It was a calculated movement, a meticulous process of spiritual censorship, where political, religious, and even economic interests intertwined to create a new order that required, as a price, the exclusion of any figure that threatened the central narrative intended to be established. As a religious system seeks to consolidate its power, it must present itself as unique, absolute, and legitimate from eternity. This means that any mention of previous or competitors' deities represents a threat, not only theological but also political. After all, if the people know that before the official god there were other worshipped sovereigns, especially a black-skinned figure who ruled with absolute power, this creates cracks in the authority of institutions that present as exclusive representatives of divine will. Think about what was happening in ancient civilizations. Religion and politics were not separate spheres. The ruler, whether pharaoh, king, or emperor, legitimized his power, claiming to be under the protection or mandate of a deity. If this deity changes, or if its story is altered, the entire basis of legitimacy of power also changes. Thus, in rewriting spiritual history, leaders and priests were not just organizing faith, they were ensuring the stability of their dominion over the people. The exclusion of the black deity may have been motivated precisely by the fear of its ancestral popularity. It was not only a religious symbol, but also cultural and identity, deeply rooted in African and Semitic peoples. If this figure continued to be worshipped, he would keep the memory of an era alive in which spiritual authority was not concentrated in the hands of the new religious elites. Worse yet, it could inspire resistance against the new order. The religious councils of antiquity, who decided what would come in and what would be left out of Scripture, had more than spiritual concerns. They were building an official story that should be uniform and coherent. In this logic, passages that mentioned earlier divine beings or describing characteristics linked to the black deity were simply cut, rewritten, or reinterpreted to fit into the new vision. Many apocryphal texts and oral traditions have been marginalized, and the population was instructed to see them as heresies or superstitions. The benefit of this was clear to those at the top of the hierarchy. A unique, centralized, and no competitor God gave the religious authorities an absolute control over doctrine and the people. There was no room for historical questions, nor for claims of spiritual sovereignty based on older traditions. The collective memory was shaped to believe that there was always only one truth, and that any other narrative would be a lie or mistake. There is also a factor of cultural identity that we cannot ignore. The figure of the black deity represented, in a symbolic and literal way, the centrality of the African continent in the spiritual history of humanity. Deleting it was also an act of cultural displacement, pushing to the periphery anything that was linked to this legacy. This allowed the dominant narrative to be built from a specific point of view, generally linked to the powers that were expanding politically and culturally. What is impressive is that this type of deletion was not done only with written documents or reports. It also happened in the visual and symbolic field. Sculptures were destroyed or adapted, murals were repaired, and symbols associated with the black deity were reconfigured to serve the new order. The result is that, throughout generations, the original image has been diluted until it seems non-existent for those who did not have access to the older sources. But even in the face of all this effort, fragments of this story survive. They are hidden in detail of works of art, in popular traditions that were never fully extinguished, in corners and legends preserved by communities that resisted the erasure. It is as if history itself found ways to protect itself, leaving clues to those who were willing to look for them. And here comes the most important point. Understanding why this story was hidden is not just an intellectual exercise. It is an act of reconnecting with deep roots, a rescue of identities that have been silenced and, when recovered, can radically change the way we understand the divine, spirituality, and even our place in the world. Now I want you who are following this investigation go to the comments and tell me, do you believe this deletion has been designed to protect the new religious and political order? Or do you think it was just the natural result of cultural changes? Write the phrase, "The truth cannot be erased," so that I know that you are aware, connecting the points and understanding the depth of what we are revealing here. Keep this reflection well, because in the next step we will investigate how, even after this whole process of censorship and rewritten, the influence of this black deity continued to echo in the life and spiritual vision of prophets and patriarchs, leaving signs that survive to this day. When we carefully examine the stories of the Old Testament prophets and patriarchs, we realize something curious. Between the lines, there are signs that these men, even while they were presented as exclusive servants of the God of Israel, knew older spiritual traditions, possibly inherited from cults that preceded biblical monotheism. These traces are not obvious to those who read superficially, but become lighter when we compare the text with archaeological records, oral traditions, and symbols present in African and Semitic civilizations long before the consolidation of the cult of Yahweh. It is as if, in the narrative fabric of the Bible, there were old wires that resisted the scissors of censorship, small fragments of expressions, symbols, and practices that indicate that Abraham, Moses, Elijah, and others did not emerge in a religious vacuum, but in a rich and plural cultural scenario, where different deities were worshipped and venerated. The Bible mentions, for example, that Abraham came from Ur-dos Chaldeans, a city that was, at the time, a center of intense religious activity, with temples dedicated to various deities. Abraham's own journey, before becoming a father of faith, begins in an environment impregnated with millennial spiritual practices. When we analyze the case of Moses, the calls become even more interesting. Greed and educated in the Egyptian court, he certainly had contact with symbols, rituals, and concepts associated with black deities, since in ancient Egypt these figures had great prominence. Interestingly, some passages from Exodus and Deuteronomy preserve images and expressions that resemble African myths about liberating gods, leaders who guided their people through hostile territories, protecting them with supernatural power. It is possible that when shaping the narrative about Yahweh, part of these old references has been absorbed, perhaps without many realizing it. Elijah, a prophet described as zealous and uncompromising in defending the cult of Yahweh, also lived at a time when ancient cults were still practiced by neighboring communities. Some of their actions, such as the confrontation on Mount Carmelo, show a clash between competing religious systems, but do not eliminate the possibility that certain elements of these services were already incorporated, veiled into the very structure of monotheism. The use of stone altars, sacrifices, and even the choice of dates and places for religious events can carry more inheritance from these old cults than you think. Old Testament enigmatic passages help reinforce this hypothesis. In some excerpts, there are mentions to Elyon, the Most High, and El Shaddai, Almighty God, as if they were distinct entities in an initial moment before being unified under the name of Yahweh. Some independent scholars point out that Elyon could be related to a supreme god worshipped before, possibly the black deity himself, who over time was reinterpreted or absorbed in the new monotheistic structure. Job's book is another intriguing example. Its language and style differ from the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, and its narrative seems to come from an older tradition in which the dialogue between the divine and the human was more direct, without formal religious intermediaries. Job's own geographical scenario, outside the central core of Israel, raises the possibility that he was influenced by spiritual traditions of African and Arab regions, where the black deity could still have some form of worship or memory. Another point that deserves attention is the ritual practices described in the Mosaic Law. The emphasis on offerings, sacrifices, and elements such as sacred oil and purifying water finds impressive parallels with millennial African rituals long before Israel's formation as people. It would not be absurd to imagine that, in instituting these practices, Moses was formalizing elements that already existed in the collective spiritual imagination, inherited from a time when the black deity still reigned in the heart of the people. This veiled influence can be compared to an underground river, invisible to the surface, but it continues to flow, silently feeding the roots of the tradition we see today. The stories, songs, and symbols of the prophets and patriarchs carry remnants of an older past, a past that points to a great cult centered on a black-skinned figure whose power and authority were undeniable. It is at this point that careful reading becomes essential. When we find terms, images, or rituals that seem displaced, as if they were not part of the linear narrative of the Bible, we may be facing fragments of this larger story, preserved without total censorship. This leads us to think, what if the great biblical leaders not only knew this black deity, but were at some point deeply influenced by it before the official narrative was shaped to hide this past? These possibilities do not diminish the role of prophets and patriarchs. On the contrary, they show that they were men of their time, living in a world of intense cultural and spiritual exchange. And perhaps part of the strength of your message came exactly from this intersection between ancient traditions and the faith that we're helping to consolidate. Now, I want you to tell me, comment OS, do you believe that prophets and patriarchs could have been influenced directly or indirectly by cults of the black deity? Write the phrase, "roots are deeper," to show that you are connecting the points and understanding the depth of this investigation. Keep this reflection well, because in the next step, we will examine something even more provocative, as, despite all the effort to hide this figure, signs and symbols continued to survive, hidden in the sight of all, infiltrated in art, liturgy, and even religious architecture, crossing centuries and reaching us. If all we have explored so far is minimally correct, then the revelation about the existence and influence of this black deity is not just a historical curiosity. It becomes a watershed capable of completely redefining the way we look at God, faith, and our own spiritual origin. And here we are not talking about a simple exchange of names or ancient recycled myths, but a deep displacement in the foundation of beliefs that shaped entire civilizations. The first implication is the most obvious. If there was a divine ruler prior to Yahweh, a sovereign worshipped by African and Semitic peoples, revered as creator, judge, and protector, then the story we know is not the full story. And when we find out that a narrative has been selectively edited, it forces us to question all other parts of this story, not to destroy faith, but to purify it, to deliver it from layers of censorship and manipulation that have been accumulated over the centuries. The second implication is more personal and intimate. What does this mean to our relationship with God? Is the faith we practice today a distant echo of something larger and older, which carried a more direct connection with the divine essence? Is it part of the spiritual distancing that many feel today is the result of the fact that the original root of faith was cut, replaced by a structure that served more to political control than to genuine spiritual awakening? Another point of reflection is about cultural and spiritual identity. If the black deity was central to the history of African and Semitic peoples, then recognizing its existence is also an act of reconnecting with systematically erased inheritances. Not only does this revalue cultures that the dominant narrative tried to marginalize, but also gives them back to the place of protagonism in the formation of human spirituality. Imagine the impact of rediscovering that the original source of faith was rooted in a people and a land that often the official history tried to reduce to the periphery of civilization. But perhaps the most important question is, what now? What do we do with this knowledge? Because it is not enough simply to have access to this information and keep living as if nothing has changed. Knowing that there was a previous divine throne, that there was a dispute in the spiritual world, which there was deliberate censorship, places us in the face of a choice to continue accepting the official version or seek for ourselves the fullness of truth. I want you to stop for a moment and ask yourself, if this black deity really ruled before, if your influence echoes to this day, what does it change in the way you understand God? Does your confidence change in religious institutions? Does it change the way you read the Bible? Does your sense of spiritual belonging change? These are questions that require brutal honesty and perhaps even initial discomfort, but can open doors for a deepening that few people have the courage to seek. This is the type of revelation that can completely transform the way you pray, how you meditate, how you connect with the divine. Because if our spiritual inheritance has been edited, it may be time to seek the pages that have been torn out, not just to know more, but to live the truth that was denied more fully. And here, once again, we see that it is not about replacing one God with another, but of understanding the continuous thread that connects the most remote past to the present. Perhaps the essence of this black deity, justice, protection, creative power, and connection with the people, is still alive, disguised, diluted, but ready to be recognized by those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. I want you to tell me in the comments, if this revelation were proven today, how do you think the world would react? Would the churches accept? Would people change their faith? Or would they try to ignore everything to keep things as they are? Write the phrase, "the truth free but bothers," so that I know that you are thinking deeply about it. And keep this feeling well, because in the next step, we will explore something even more provocative. How this story remains alive, even after millennia, in symbols, in the images, and even the rituals you may have seen, but never realized they carried the maw of the black deity. This will connect all the pieces and show that, despite all the efforts to erase this figure, it never ceased to be present, even in a hidden way. If you have gotten here until the end of this video, it is because you really want to go beyond the surface and seek the truth that few have the courage to face. And that's exactly why I want you to be part of this search engine community. So, now click on the sign button, activate the bell to receive all the next content, because this investigation is just starting, and I promise that what ahead will surprise you even more. And for me to know that you are one of those who stay until the end, comment below the phrase, "I really hidden." This will show me that you are part of the select group that is connecting all the pieces of this puzzle with me. Also, don't forget to leave your like. It is critical for this video to reach more people who need to know this story. And now, enjoy that you are here, and already click on the next video that is appearing on your screen, because in it, we keep unraveling secrets that will completely transform your vision about the divine and the history of humanity.